In the year AD 1110, an extremely strange event occurred over the skies of medieval England. The moon completely vanished. By May, it had already been a particularly bad year for England and other countries in northwest Europe, with torrential rains damaging the crops, leading to severe famine for much of the population. Did the disappearance of the moon have anything to do with this? The mysterious disappearance was recorded by witnesses in England in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, an annual record of events in England, originally compiled around 890 during the reign of King Alfred the Great. It contains an account of the history of Britain from 60 BC until the reign of King Alfred, and was the first attempt to give a methodical year-by-year account of English history, and it was subsequently maintained and added to by generations of anonymous scribes until the middle of the 1100s. The original manuscript was apparently copied at the city of Winchester and sent throughout England to significant centres of regional culture, where local scribes would receive regular updates from the capital, but also started recording events of local interest. Consequently, after about 915, the several manuscripts began to differ significantly. What is known by scholars as Manuscript E of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle is also called the Peterborough Chronicle, after the monastery where the text was copied and maintained up until the year 1154, when its last entry records the death of King Stephen. The Peterborough Chronicle was the only manuscript of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle maintained after the year 1080. According to the Peterborough Chronicle, on the fifth night in the month of May appeared the moon shining bright in the evening, and afterward, little by little, its light diminished. As soon as night came, it was so completely extinguished withal that neither light, nor orb, nor anything at all of it was seen, and so it continued nearly until day, and then it appeared shining full and bright. We know that the moon wasn't simply obscured by clouds, as the anonymous scribe went on to describe how bright and sparkling the stars appeared as the moon faded from view. The most obvious explanation for the vanishing moon is the occurrence of a lunar eclipse. However, if the description in the chronicle is accurate, the moon went completely dark and did not seem to have taken on its usual reddish-orange hue, which is what happens during an eclipse. So perhaps there's another explanation for what happened. In May 2020, it was reported that by combining the eyewitness reports in the Peterborough Chronicle with an analysis of tree ring records and ice cores, scientists had worked out why the moon became so dark in May 1110. The team from the University of Geneva believe it was caused by a group of volcanic eruptions which occurred in the early 12th century. The eruptions had extensive climatic effects, causing temperatures in the northern hemisphere to fall by roughly 1 degree centigrade. The study, published in April 2020 in the journal Scientific Reports, gives a possible explanation for the moon's disappearance on May 5th, 1110, as well as for the calamitous rains throughout that year. Volcanoes. The author of the study wrote, "The spectacular atmospheric optical phenomena associated with high-altitude volcanic aerosols have caught the attention of chroniclers since ancient times. Careful evaluation of ice records points to the occurrence of several closely spaced volcanic eruptions." Essentially, the study says that around a millennium ago, a huge disturbance occurred in the Earth's atmosphere. A massive cloud of sulfur-rich particles flowed throughout the stratosphere, turning skies dark for months or perhaps even years, before eventually falling back down to Earth. This disturbance was caused by volcanic events, which the researchers in the report have labelled a forgotten cluster of eruptions, as they were only sporadically documented by historians at the time. These eruptions could have released immense clouds of ash that travelled around the world for many years. According to the researchers, such high-altitude veil of volcanic aerosols would eclipse the moon while leaving many stars unobscured, just as the Peterborough Chronicle scribe described. Furthermore, a series of large eruptions might also have disturbed the global climate, intensifying or even causing the cold, wet weather that made life so hard in AD 1110. The team think that one of these eruptions, which occurred in Japan in AD 1108, could be responsible. In their search for evidence of these so-called forgotten volcanic eruptions, the the researchers examined ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica, which are extremely useful for dating past volcanic events. Ice cores are cylinders of ice drilled out of an ice sheet or glacier, mostly from Antarctica and Greenland. The longest ice cores extend to 1.9 miles in depth, and the oldest continuous ice records so far obtained extend 123,000 years into the past in Greenland and 800,000 years in Antarctica. Lead researcher, paleoclimatologist Sebastian Guillet from the University of Geneva in Switzerland said, "A prominent discovery arising from this revised ice core dating is a major and hitherto unrecognized bipolar volcanic signal with sulfate deposition starting in late 1108 or early 1109 and persisting until early 1113 in the Greenland record." What the team discovered was an increase in sulfate aerosols, an element of volcanic ash, in both cores between AD 1108 and AD 1110, signifying that the stratosphere was dotted with fumes from a recent eruption. The team found additional evidence of volcanic activity using dendrochronology, the study of data from tree ring growth, where we can study the environmental conditions of the past, locally or globally, based on the information contained in tree rings. Tree rings change thickness in response to climate patterns. The rings in the trees from the period of the eruptions showed that 1109 was remarkably cold, wet in Western Europe, a climatic anomaly equivalent to the effects of a number of other important volcanic eruptions from history. The researchers also examined other narrative accounts of adverse weather, crop failure, and famine from the relevant time period, further backing up the theory that a series of volcanic eruptions had torn into Europe's climate. The team wrote that the sources of these eruptions remain unknown, yet one eruption with a historical date in this period is that of Mount Asuma in Japan. One of the written sources examined by the researchers was a diary written by a Japanese statesman between 1062 and 1141. According to this document, the eruption of Mount Asana in central Japan started towards the end of August 1108 and continued until October of that year. The diary entry describes the 1108 event. There was a fire at the top of the volcano, a thick layer of ash in the governor's garden. Everywhere the fields and the rice fields are rendered unfit for cultivation. We never saw that in the country. It is a very strange and rare thing. This huge month-long eruption in the year was significantly greater than a subsequent eruption in 1783 that killed over 1,400 people. The team discovered other historical documentation, specifically accounts of climatic and social impacts in the years between AD 1109 and 1111 CE, which would corroborate their theory with an 1108 eruption, or series of eruptions that began that year, may well have led to catastrophic events on those communities affected. The team discovered an abundance of testimonies referring to adverse weather, crop failures and famines in these years, adding that the assembled evidence suggests that the subsistence difficulties, which began in 1109, deepened into famine in several regions of Western Europe. However, a number of researchers disagree with this conclusion. They believe that a lunar eclipse may have been responsible for the vanishing moon described in the Peterborough Chronicle, and that the heavy rainfall and famine are just a coincidence. Indeed, according to NASA records, based on astronomical retrocalculation, several lunar eclipses would have been visible in Europe for the first 20 years of the last millennium, between 1100 and AD 1120. In the centuries following the event, a number of astronomers discussed this strange and unusually dark lunar eclipse. Many centuries after it occurred, the English astronomer George Frederick Chambers, who died in 1915, wrote about it, saying, "It is evident that this eclipse was an instance of a black eclipse when the moon becomes quite invisible instead of shining with the familiar coppery hue." Nevertheless, the research team from the University of Geneva believe they have finally found the answer to the mystery of the disappearing moon of the 5th of May AD 1100. Rather than being caused by a lunar eclipse, it was probably due to a thick cloud of volcanic dust blocking the moon's light in the higher layers of the Earth's atmosphere. The impacts of such an event would surely have been more than physical on the affected populations. In the words of Sebastian Guillet, While understanding of the climate forcing associated with large volcanic eruptions has advanced greatly, the wider environmental impacts and consequences of volcanism on the trajectories of human societies remain only partially explored, especially for the early and high medieval periods.